Poor girl arrived at the interview without shoes. The Millionaire CEO froze when he saw her pendant. The December wind cut through Grace Sullivan's thin coat like a knife through butter, but she barely felt it anymore. After 3 years of New York winters without proper heating, her body had learned to go numb. What she couldn't ignore was the way her broken shoes slapped against the icy sidewalk with each step. The sole of her left sneaker flapping like a tired mouth trying to speak. She stopped at the corner of 5th Avenue and 42nd Street, pulling the shoes off her feet with a grimace. Better to walk barefoot than listen to that embarrassing sound echoing off the glass towers around her. The concrete felt like stepping on frozen razor blades, but at least it was honest pain. "You're gonna make it, Gracie," she whispered to herself. The same words her dad used to say when she scraped her knees as a kid. Sullivan women don't quit. But Thomas Sullivan had been gone for 5 years now. And some days, Grace wondered if she'd inherited his stubborn streak or just his bad luck. The Whitmore Corporation building stretched 30 floors into the gray December sky, all steel and glass, and the kind of money that didn't worry about broken shoes. Grace had walked past it 100 times on her way to various temp jobs, never imagining she'd actually step inside. Hell, she never imagined they'd even look at someone like her. But desperate times called for desperate measures, and Grace Sullivan was about as desperate as they came. Her phone buzzed. A text from Mount Sinai Hospital. Another bill. Another reminder that her mother's condition was getting worse while their bank account got smaller. Eleanor Sullivan's medical expenses had already eaten through their savings, their emergency fund, and what little inheritance Dad had left them. Now they were drowning in debt, and Grace was running out of life preservers to throw. She'd been working 3 jobs for the past year, cleaning offices at night, serving coffee during morning rush, and doing data entry whenever she could find it. But it wasn't enough. It was never enough. The doctors kept talking about experimental treatments, specialists, procedures that might give her mom more time. All of it cost money. Grace didn't have and couldn't borrow. The Whitmore job posting had appeared like a Christmas miracle on the employment website. Executive assistant, immediate opening, competitive salary. Grace had stared at the screen for 10 minutes, convinced it was too good to be true. Companies like Whitmore didn't hire girls from Queens who'd never finished college. But she'd sent her resume anyway. Because what did she have to lose? When they called for an interview, Grace had to sit down. Her hands were shaking so hard she could barely hold the phone. "Ms. Sullivan, we'd like to meet with you tomorrow at 10 a.m., the crisp voice had said. "Please bring references and dress professionally." Grace looked down at her reflection in the Whitmore building's polished glass doors. Professional, right. Her best outfit was a navy blazer she'd bought at Goodwill and a skirt that had seen better days. But she'd ironed everything last night until the creases were sharp enough to cut glass, and she'd borrowed lipstick from her neighbor, Mrs. Chen. Her fingers found the small golden pendant hanging around her neck, the only piece of jewelry she owned. Mom had given it to her just 3 months ago, on one of her better days when the pain medications weren't making her too foggy to speak clearly. "This was your father's most important gift to you," Eleanor had said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He wanted you to have it when the time was right." Grace had tried to ask what that meant, but her mother had drifted off to sleep, leaving her with more questions than answers. The pendant was beautiful, delicate gold work, with what looked like a small compartment, though Grace had never been able to figure out how to open it. She'd worn it every day since, finding comfort in the weight of it against her chest. Taking a deep breath that came out as a white puff in the cold air, Grace pushed through the revolving doors of the Whitmore Corporation. The lobby hit her like a slap of wealth. Marble floors that probably cost more than her annual rent, chandeliers that belonged in a museum, and the kind of hushed atmosphere that whispered money in every echo. Men in $1,000 suits walked past like they owned the world, and maybe they did. Grace's bare feet made no sound on the marble, but she felt every eye in the lobby tracking her movement. The security guard's raised eyebrow, the receptionist's poorly hidden smirk, the businessman who actually stopped walking to stare at her shoes dangling from her hand. Heat flooded her cheeks, but Grace kept her chin up. She'd learned a long time ago that dignity was free, and sometimes it was all you had. "I have an appointment," she told the receptionist, a woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a fashion magazine. "Grace Sullivan, 10 a.m. with HR." The woman's manicured fingers clicked across her keyboard with obvious reluctance. "32nd floor. Elevators are to your right." The elevator ride felt like ascending to another planet. By the 20th floor, Grace was pretty sure she'd left her world behind entirely. When the doors opened on 32, she was greeted by more marble, more glass, and the overwhelming scent of expensive cologne and fresh flowers. Ms. Sullivan, a woman in a perfect pantsuit, appeared at her elbow. "I'm Janet from Human Resources, right this way." Grace followed Janet down a hallway lined with portraits of stern-looking men in expensive suits. Probably the Whitmore family tree, she figured. Old money, old power, old everything. The kind of people who'd never had to choose between groceries and medication. "Just so you know," Janet said as they walked, her voice carrying that particular tone people used when they were about to deliver bad news. "Mr. Whitmore himself will be conducting this interview. He likes to meet potential assistants personally." Grace's stomach dropped. She'd been hoping for a middle manager, someone who might overlook her lack of experience if she could prove she was a hard worker. But the CEO himself, that was like being thrown into the deep end of a pool when you'd barely learned to dog paddle. They stopped outside an office door that probably cost more than Grace's apartment. Janet knocked twice, then pushed it open without waiting for an answer. "Mr. Whitmore, Ms. Sullivan is here for her interview." Grace stepped into the office and immediately felt smaller. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of Manhattan that made the city look like a toy set. The desk was the size of her kitchen table, and behind it sat a man who looked like he'd been carved from granite and expensive tailoring. Jonathan Whitmore was younger than she'd expected, maybe mid-30s, with dark hair and the kind of sharp features that belonged on magazine covers. But his eyes were cold, business cold, the eyes of someone who'd never had to worry about broken shoes or empty refrigerators. He looked up from a stack of papers, and Grace saw the exact moment he decided she wasn't worth his time. It was a look she'd gotten used to over the years, but it still stung. "Ms. Sullivan." His voice carried the authority of someone who was used to being obeyed. "Please sit." Grace lowered herself into the leather chair across from his desk, hyper-aware of her bare feet tucked under the chair. Her hand unconsciously went to the pendant at her throat, drawing comfort from its familiar weight. And that's when everything changed. Jonathan Whitmore's eyes locked onto the golden pendant, and the color drained from his face like someone had pulled a plug. His pen clattered to the desk, and for a moment, Grace thought he might be having some kind of medical emergency. "Where?" His voice came out as a croak. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Where did you get that necklace?" Grace's fingers tightened protectively around the pendant. "It was my father's." "Why?" But Jonathan Whitmore wasn't listening anymore. He was staring at the pendant like he'd seen a ghost. And maybe he had, because Grace didn't know it yet. But she was wearing the twin to a necklace that had been buried with Margaret Whitmore 5 years ago. The same necklace that had disappeared the night Thomas Sullivan died trying to save a woman he'd never met. The same night that would connect their two families forever in ways neither of them could have imagined. The silence in Jonathan Whitmore's office stretched like a taut wire about to snap. Grace watched his face cycle through emotions she couldn't name. Shock, grief, something that looked almost like fear. His eyes hadn't left the pendant since she'd touched it, and the intensity of his stare was making her skin crawl. "Sir," Grace's voice seemed to break whatever spell had captured him. "Is everything all right?" Jonathan blinked hard, like someone waking from a dream, and suddenly the cold businessman mask was back in place. But Grace had seen behind it now, seen the raw vulnerability that had cracked his composure, and she knew something was seriously wrong. "The necklace," he said again, his voice steadier now but still carrying an edge that made Grace want to run. "It's quite distinctive. I'm curious about its history." Grace's hand moved protectively to cover the pendant. She'd grown up in Queens. She knew when someone was fishing for information they had no right to. "Like I said, it belonged to my father. He died 5 years ago." Something flickered across Jonathan's features at the mention of 5 years, but he recovered quickly. "I'm sorry for your loss. What was your father's name?" "Thomas Sullivan?" Grace lifted her chin, pride creeping into her voice despite her nerves. "He was a driver, worked for wealthy families around the city." The pen in Jonathan's hand snapped. The sharp crack made Grace jump, and she watched in fascination as black ink spread across his pristine desk like spilled blood. Jonathan stared down at the broken pieces as if he'd never seen a pen before, his knuckles white where they gripped the remains. "Thomas Sullivan," he repeated slowly. And Grace heard something dangerous in his tone. Did he ever mention the families he worked for? Sometimes? Grace was getting tired of this interrogation. She'd come here for a job interview, not the Spanish Inquisition. Look, Mr. Whitmore, I appreciate you taking the time to see me, but if you're not interested in hiring me, I should probably... You're hired. The words hit Grace like a physical blow. She blinked, certain she'd misheard. I'm sorry, what? You're hired, Jonathan repeated, his voice gaining strength. Executive assistant position. Salary is $80,000 annually. Full benefits including health insurance. You can start Monday. Grace's mouth fell open. $80,000 was more money than she'd ever dreamed of making. It was enough to pay for her mother's treatments. Enough to get them out of their cramped apartment. Enough to finally breathe again. It was also completely insane. Mr. Whitmore, you haven't even looked at my resume. You don't know anything about my qualifications, my experience. I know enough. He was already reaching for his phone, his movements sharp and decisive. Janet, please prepare an employment contract for Ms. Sullivan, standard executive assistant package. He paused, his eyes finding Grace's face again. Actually, make it the premium package, full coverage. Grace felt like she'd fallen down a rabbit hole. Premium package. She didn't even know what that meant, but it sounded expensive. Way too expensive for someone who'd walked into this interview barefoot and desperate. Sir, I think there's been some kind of mistake. No mistake. Jonathan set down the phone and leaned back in his chair, but Grace could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw was clenched tight. You need a job, Ms. Sullivan. I need an assistant. It's a simple transaction. But nothing about this felt simple. Grace had learned to read people during her years of struggling to survive, and Jonathan Whitmore was broadcasting signals she couldn't decode. The way he kept looking at her pendant, the way her father's name had made him break that pen, the way he was throwing money at her like he was trying to solve a problem she didn't understand. Why? The question slipped out before she could stop it. Why me? You could hire anyone, someone with experience, education, connections. Why hire someone you met 5 minutes ago? For a moment, Jonathan's mask slipped again, and Grace saw something that looked almost like pain flash across his features. Because, he said quietly, sometimes the universe has a sense of humor, and sometimes we owe debts we didn't know we'd accumulated. Before Grace could ask what the hell that meant, Jonathan was standing, smoothing down his suit jacket with movements that were just a little too controlled. Janet will get you set up with HR paperwork. You'll need a company credit card for business expenses, and we'll arrange for a wardrobe allowance. Wardrobe allowance. Grace looked down at her Goodwill blazer and felt heat flood her cheeks. Of course, they couldn't have the CEO's assistant walking around looking like she'd been dressed by a charity shop. Mr. Whitmore, I don't understand any of this. 5 minutes ago you looked like you were going to throw me out of here, and now you're offering me more money than I've ever seen. What changed? Jonathan walked around his desk, moving closer to her, and Grace caught a whiff of expensive cologne and something else. Coffee, maybe, and the faint scent of grief that seemed to cling to him like smoke. When he spoke, his voice was soft enough that she had to strain to hear it. Tell me about the night your father died. The question hit Grace like a punch to the stomach. She'd spent 5 years trying not to think about that night, trying to forget the phone call that had shattered her world into a million pieces. Why would you want to know about that? Humor me. Grace studied his face, looking for clues about what game they were playing. But all she saw was a man who looked like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. And for some reason, her answer mattered to him. There was an accident, she said finally. December 15th, 5 years ago, Dad was driving for a client, and there was a crash. They said he died trying to help someone else who was hurt. Her voice cracked slightly on the last words. He always did that, put other people first. Jonathan had gone very still, like a statue carved from marble and expensive fabric. December 15th, he repeated, and Grace heard something break in his voice. You know something about it. It wasn't a question. Grace could see the knowledge written all over his face, in the way his hands had started to shake, in the way he was looking at her like she was a ghost. You know something about my father's death, Ms. Sullivan. Grace, the word came out harder than she'd intended. If we're going to work together, if you're going to pay me enough money to save my mother's life, then you can call me Grace. And you can tell me why hearing my father's name made you look like you'd seen the devil himself." Jonathan was quiet for so long that Grace wondered if he'd heard her. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because," he said, "5 years ago, on December 15th, my wife Margaret was killed in a car accident, and the man who died trying to save her was named Thomas Sullivan." The words hit Grace like a freight train. She felt the blood drain from her face, felt the world tilt sideways as everything she thought she knew rearranged itself into a new, impossible pattern. Her father hadn't just died in some random accident. He'd died trying to save Jonathan Whitmore's wife. And somehow, that death had connected their two families in ways Grace was only beginning to understand. "The pendant," Jonathan continued, his eyes fixed on the golden chain around her neck. "Margaret was wearing one exactly like it the night she died. I buried it with her." Grace's hand flew to her throat, fingers wrapping around the pendant that suddenly felt red hot against her skin. "That's impossible, is it?" Jonathan moved closer, close enough that Grace could see the pain carved into the lines around his eyes. "Tell me, Grace Sullivan, what else did your father leave you? What else did he want you to have?" But Grace couldn't answer, because she was too busy remembering her mother's words, the way Eleanor had pressed the pendant into her hands with shaking fingers. "This was your father's most important gift to you. He wanted you to have it when the time was right." And Grace was starting to realize that the time was right. Whether she was ready for it or not, Grace's first day at Whitmore Corporation felt like being dropped into an alien world where everything cost more than her rent, and everyone spoke in coded conversations she couldn't understand. Janet from HR had spent the morning drowning her in paperwork, tax forms, confidentiality agreements, insurance documents that made Grace's head spin with their generosity, dental, vision, life insurance, something called a wellness package that apparently included gym memberships and therapy sessions. Grace had signed everything in a daze, still reeling from yesterday's revelations. "Your office is adjacent to Mr. Whitmore's," Janet explained as they walked down the marble-lined hallway. "You'll handle his calendar, correspondence, travel arrangements, and any special projects he assigns." Grace nodded. Though she was barely listening, her mind kept circling back to Jonathan's words. "My wife Margaret was wearing one exactly like it the night she died. Every time she touched the pendant, it felt like touching a live wire." "This is you," Janet said, stopping at a door marked with a brass nameplate that read, "G. Sullivan, Executive Assistant." The office was bigger than Grace's bedroom back home. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of Central Park that probably cost more per square foot than most people made in a year. The desk was polished mahogany, the chair leather that looked like it had never been sat in, and there was even a small sitting area with a couch that Grace was afraid to touch. "Mr. Whitmore asked me to give you this," Janet said, producing a black credit card from her folder. "For business expenses and your wardrobe allowance, the PIN is your employee ID number." Grace stared at the card like it might bite her. "How much is the wardrobe allowance?" $5,000 to start, mister. Whitmore was very specific that you should have everything you need to represent the company appropriately. $5,000. For clothes, Grace had never owned $5,000 worth of anything in her entire life. "Janet," Grace said slowly, "this is all really generous, but I have to ask, is this normal? Do all executive assistants get this kind of treatment?" Janet's smile was perfectly professional and completely empty. "Mr. Whitmore values loyalty and discretion above all else. Ms. Sullivan, I'm sure you'll prove worthy of his investment." After Janet left, Grace sank into her new chair and tried to process what was happening to her life. 3 days ago, she'd been choosing between paying the electric bill and buying groceries. Now she was sitting in an office that probably cost more to furnish than she'd made in the past 2 years. Her phone buzzed. A text from Mount Sinai. For the first time in months, Grace opened it without that familiar spike of panic. The bill was still huge, still impossible, but for the first time it felt manageable. With her new salary and the health insurance that would kick in after 30 days, she might actually be able to give her mother the treatment she needed. The thought should have filled her with relief. But instead, Grace felt a gnawing unease in her stomach. Nothing in life was this easy. Rich men didn't just hand out 6-figure jobs to girls from Queens because they felt generous. There was always a catch, always a price to pay. and Grace was starting to suspect that Price had something to do with the golden pendant hanging around her neck. A soft knock on her door made her look up. Jonathan Whitmore stood in the doorway, and Grace felt that strange flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the way he filled out that expensive suit. "Settling in?" he asked, stepping into her office with the kind of confidence that came from owning everything in sight. "It's beautiful," Grace said honestly. "More than I ever expected." "Good." Jonathan moved to the window, hands clasped behind his back as he looked out at the city below. "I wanted to apologize for yesterday. I know my reaction to your pendant was unexpected." Grace watched his reflection in the glass, noting the tension in his shoulders, the way he held himself like he was bracing for impact. "You said your wife had one like it. Identical," Jonathan said quietly. "Down to the smallest detail. I had it made specially for our first anniversary. There was only supposed to be one. Maybe the jeweler made copies." Jonathan turned to face her, and Grace saw something dark flicker across his features. "The jeweler was my college roommate. He swore there was only one, and Margaret never took it off. She was wearing it when she died." The weight of the pendant against Grace's chest suddenly felt suffocating. "What are you saying?" "I don't know what I'm saying." Jonathan ran a hand through his dark hair, messing up the perfect styling. "All I know is that seeing that pendant brought back memories I've spent 5 years trying to forget." Grace felt something shift between them, a recognition of shared grief that made the air in the room feel thicker. "Tell me about her." Jonathan's smile was small and sad. "Margaret was light. You know those people who walk into a room and everything just gets brighter? That was her. She believed in fixing things, helping people. It drove my father crazy. He thought philanthropy was just throwing money at problems. But Margaret, she got her hands dirty, volunteered at shelters, visited hospitals, actually listened to people. She sounds wonderful." "She was." Jonathan's voice cracked slightly. "And she died because I wasn't there to protect her." Grace felt an unexpected surge of sympathy for this man who seemed to have everything, but couldn't save the one thing that mattered most. "My dad was the same way, always helping people, even when he couldn't afford to help himself." "Thomas," Jonathan said, and the name hung between them like a bridge. Neither of them was ready to cross. "Yeah." Grace's throat felt tight. "He used to say that kindness was the only thing that cost nothing and was worth everything." They stood in silence for a moment. Two people connected by tragedy and loss, and a golden pendant that shouldn't exist. Grace wanted to ask more questions. About that night, about Margaret, about why her father had been driving for the Whitmore family, but something in Jonathan's posture warned her off, like a door slowly closing. "I should let you get settled," Jonathan said finally. "If you need anything at all, just call." He was almost to the door when Grace found her voice. "Mr. Whitmore, thank you for the job, for the opportunity. I know I'm not qualified for this position, and I know there are probably 100 people who deserve it more than I do, but I want you to know that I won't let you down." Jonathan paused, his hand on the doorframe. When he looked back at her, Grace saw something vulnerable in his eyes, something that made her chest tight. "Grace," he said softly, "I have a feeling you're more qualified than you know." After he left, Grace sat alone in her beautiful office, staring out at a view of Central Park that still didn't feel real. Her fingers found the pendant again. Tracing its familiar curves, she'd worn it every day for 3 months, and it had never felt significant before. Just a pretty piece of jewelry her father had wanted her to have. But now, knowing that Margaret Whitmore had worn an identical piece, knowing that both she and Grace's father had died on the same night, Grace pulled out her phone and dialed Mount Sinai. "Hi, this is Grace Sullivan. I wanted to check on my mother, Eleanor Sullivan, in room 314. One moment, please." The nurse's voice was tired but kind. "Ms. Sullivan, your mother is stable today. She's been asking for you." "I'll be there tonight," Grace promised. "And tell her we're going to be okay. The money situation, the treatments, we're going to be okay." "That's wonderful news. Honey, I know she's been worried." Grace hung up and leaned back in her leather chair, trying to imagine her mother's relief when she heard the news. Eleanor had been carrying the guilt of her medical bills like a stone in her chest, apologizing constantly for being sick, for costing money they didn't have, but now Grace could fix it. She could pay for the treatments, the specialists, maybe even the experimental therapy Dr. Martinez had mentioned. All because a man who'd lost his wife had seen a pendant and decided to change Grace's life. The thought should have made her happy, but instead, Grace felt a growing sense of unease. Rich men didn't just hand out miracles because they felt like it, and Jonathan Whitmore was hiding something. She could see it in the way he looked at her, in the careful way he spoke about that night 5 years ago. Grace had learned to be suspicious of good fortune, because in her experience, it usually came with strings attached, and she was starting to realize that those strings might be wrapped around a golden pendant that held more secrets than she'd ever imagined. As the sun set over Manhattan, casting long shadows across her new office, Grace Sullivan made herself a promise. She would find out the truth about that night, about her father's death, and about why Jonathan Whitmore was really paying her enough money to save her mother's life, even if that truth destroyed the miracle she so desperately needed. 3 weeks into her new life at Whitmore Corporation, Grace was starting to feel like she was living in someone else's dream. Her closet now held clothes that actually fit. Her refrigerator was full for the first time in years, and she'd been able to pay Mount Sinai enough to stop the threatening letters, but the dream had sharp edges. Every day, she watched Jonathan move through the office like a man carrying invisible weights. He was polite, professional, even kind in his distant way. But Grace caught him staring at her pendant when he thought she wasn't looking, and sometimes she'd find him standing at his office window with the expression of someone watching ghosts. The other employees had made their feelings about her clear from day one. Whispered conversations that stopped when she walked by. Meaningful looks exchanged over her head. Cynthia from accounting had actually asked her, with saccharine sweetness, if she'd had to do anything special to land such a prestigious position. Grace had wanted to tell Cynthia exactly what she could do with her implications, but she'd bitten her tongue. She needed this job too much to risk losing it over office politics. Today felt different, though. Jonathan had been in meetings all morning, and Grace had caught up on all his correspondence, organized his calendar for the next month, and even managed to reschedule a conference call with Tokyo that had been keeping him up nights. For the first time since starting, she actually felt competent. She was reaching for her purse when the pendant got caught on the edge of her desk drawer. Grace tugged gently, but the chain was tangled on something inside the drawer mechanism. Cursing under her breath, she pulled harder. The pendant twisted in her fingers, and suddenly Grace felt something give way with a tiny click. She froze, staring down at the jewelry in her palm. What had once been a solid golden oval now had a hairline crack running around its circumference. Grace's heart sank. She'd broken the most precious thing her father had left her. But as she examined the damage more closely, she realized it wasn't broken at all. The crack was actually a seam, so fine she'd never noticed it before, and now it was slightly open, revealing a darkness inside. With trembling fingers, Grace worked at the seam until the pendant opened like a tiny golden locket. Inside, nestled in a custom-fitted compartment, was something that made her blood run cold, a micro SD card. Grace stared at the tiny piece of technology, her mind racing. This wasn't some family heirloom or sentimental keepsake. This was modern, purposeful, hidden. She looked around the office, suddenly paranoid that someone might be watching, but the floor was quiet, most people having left for lunch. With shaking hands, Grace slipped the SD card into her laptop's adapter slot. The screen filled with folders marked with dates, names she didn't recognize, and financial records that made her head spin. But one folder caught her attention immediately. Emergency, for T's. Thomas Sullivan, her father. Grace double-clicked the folder, and her world exploded. The first file was a video message, and Grace's breath caught in her throat as Margaret Whitmore's face filled the screen. She was beautiful. Dark hair, kind eyes, the sort of smile that made you trust her immediately. But in this video, she looked terrified. Thomas, Margaret's voice was barely above a whisper. If you're watching this, then something has happened to me. I need you to know that everything I told you about the Whitmore family is true. They're not just corrupt. They're murderers. Grace's hand flew to her mouth. On screen, Margaret glanced nervously over her shoulder before continuing. I found the files, the real ones. Charles has been using the company to launder money for some truly horrible people. When businesses wouldn't sell to him, when politicians wouldn't play ball, people died. Car accidents, heart attacks, overdoses, all made to look natural, all orchestrated by my father-in-law. The video showed Margaret holding up documents, financial records, photographs of men Grace didn't recognize. I tried to go to the police, but Charles has people everywhere. FBI, NYPD, District Attorney's Office. I don't know who I can trust anymore. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. I know I'm putting you in danger by asking this, but you're the only person I can trust. If something happens to me, please make sure these files get to someone who can stop him. Someone outside his reach. The video ended, but Grace's laptop was still loading files. Bank records showing massive transfers to offshore accounts. Photos of meetings between Charles Whitmore and men whose faces belonged in FBI wanted posters. Recorded phone conversations where Charles casually discussed eliminating problems and permanent solutions. And then Grace found the file that stopped her heart. A police report from 5 years ago, marked confidential, do not distribute. The official report on the accident that killed Margaret Whitmore and Thomas Sullivan. But this wasn't the sanitized version Grace had heard from the news reports. This was the real investigation, complete with witness statements that had never made it to trial, forensic evidence that had been buried, and a conclusion that made Grace's hands shake so hard she could barely read. The accident had been staged. Someone had tampered with the brakes on Margaret's car, knowing she would be driving that route at that specific time. Thomas Sullivan hadn't just been an unlucky bystander. He'd been a target too, because Margaret had told him everything. Grace scrolled through the forensic photos, her stomach churning, but one detail caught her attention. Margaret's body had been found without jewelry. No rings, no earrings, and specifically no pendant. The original police report noted, missing jewelry, likely stolen post-mortem or lost during extraction. But Grace was wearing that pendant right now, which meant that somehow, in the moments before she died, Margaret had gotten the pendant to Thomas, had given him the only copy of evidence that could destroy the Whitmore family. Grace's phone buzzed, making her jump so hard she nearly knocked over her coffee. A text from Mount Sinai. Your mother is asking for you. She seems agitated about something. Can you come in today? Grace stared at the message, her mind connecting dots she didn't want to connect. Her mother had given her the pendant 3 months ago, saying it was from her father, saying he'd wanted her to have it when the time was right. What if Eleanor knew? What if she'd been keeping this secret for 5 years, waiting for the right moment to pass on evidence that could bring down one of the most powerful families in New York? Grace quickly copied all the files to her personal cloud storage, then deleted them from her work computer. Her hands were still shaking as she closed the laptop and slipped the SD card back into the pendant. The tiny compartment closed with the same soft click, leaving no trace that it had ever been opened. But Grace's world had changed forever. She wasn't just working for Jonathan Whitmore anymore. She was sitting on evidence that could destroy him, his family, and everything they'd built. Evidence that proved her father had been murdered for trying to help a woman who'd discovered the truth about her own family's crimes. Grace gathered her purse and coat, her mind racing with implications she wasn't ready to face. She needed to see her mother, needed to understand how much Eleanor knew about what she'd handed over 3 months ago. But as she headed for the elevator, one thought kept echoing in her mind. If the Whitmore family had killed Margaret and Thomas to protect their secrets 5 years ago, what would they do to Grace? Now that she knew the truth, the elevator doors closed behind her, and Grace Sullivan realized she was no longer just fighting for her mother's life. She was fighting for her own. The familiar antiseptic smell of Mount Sinai hit Grace like a wall as she hurried through the corridors toward her mother's room. Her mind was still reeling from the contents of the SD card, and every face she passed seemed suspicious. Every conversation felt like it might be about her. Eleanor Sullivan looked smaller every time Grace visited, as if the cancer was slowly erasing her from the world. But today, her mother's eyes were sharp and alert in a way Grace hadn't seen in months. "Gracie," Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried an urgency that made Grace's chest tight. "Close the door. We need to talk." Grace shut the door and pulled a chair close to the bed. "Mom, what's wrong? The nurse said you were agitated." Eleanor's thin fingers grasped Grace's hand with surprising strength. "The pendant. You opened it, didn't you?" The world tilted sideways. Grace stared at her mother, feeling like she'd been punched in the stomach. "You knew, this whole time. You knew what was inside." I knew there was something, Eleanor said, her voice gaining strength. Your father came home that night, December 15th, covered in blood that wasn't his own, carrying that pendant like it was made of plutonium. He was terrified, Gracie, more scared than I'd ever seen him. Grace's throat felt tight. Tell me what happened. Tell me everything. Eleanor closed her eyes, and for a moment Grace thought she'd drifted off. But when she spoke, her voice was clear and steady, like she'd been rehearsing this story for 5 years. Thomas was working late that night, driving for the Whitmore family. He'd been their driver for about 6 months. Good money, respectful family, or so we thought, Mrs. Whitmore was a lovely woman. Always asked about you, always treated your father like family instead of hired help. Grace squeezed her mother's hand, encouraging her to continue. That night, Mrs. Whitmore asked Thomas to drive her to some charity meeting uptown. But on the way, she got a phone call that changed everything. Thomas said she went white as a sheet, started crying, begging whoever was on the phone to give her more time. Eleanor's breathing became labored, and Grace helped her sit up straighter before she continued. Then Mrs. Whitmore told Thomas to change course. She had him drive to some storage facility in Queens instead. She was gone for maybe 20 minutes, came back carrying a briefcase and looking like she'd seen the devil himself. The evidence, Grace whispered. Must have been. She told Thomas that her father-in-law was a monster, that she'd found proof of things that would destroy the whole family. She was planning to take it to the FBI the next morning. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. But they never made it to the FBI. Did they? The accident, Grace said, though she knew now it hadn't been an accident at all. Thomas said the brakes failed on the highway. The car went off the road, rolled 3 times. Mrs. Whitmore was trapped inside, bleeding bad. Thomas managed to crawl out, tried to get her free, but the car was too damaged. Eleanor paused, her breathing shallow. That's when she gave him the pendant, pulled it right off her neck with the last of her strength, and pressed it into his hands. She said it contained copies of everything, that it was the only way to stop them. She made him promise to keep it safe, to find someone who could use it when the time was right. But Dad never used it, Grace said, confusion making her voice sharp. He died that same night. Eleanor's laugh was bitter and hollow. Oh, honey, your father didn't die in that accident. The words hit Grace like a physical blow. What? Thomas got Mrs. Whitmore out of the car just before it caught fire. She died in his arms on the side of the highway, but he survived the crash. He called 911, gave his statement to the first responders, and then he called me. Grace felt like the ground was disappearing beneath her feet. I don't understand. He was walking to the hospital, Gracie, just bruised and shaken up, but alive. He called me from a payphone about 2 blocks from Mount Sinai. That was the last time I heard his voice. The room started spinning. Then how did he die? Hit and run, Eleanor said, and the words came out like broken glass. 2 blocks from the hospital where he was supposed to be giving his statement about the accident. Witnesses said a black sedan came out of nowhere, hit him at full speed, and never even slowed down. Grace felt bile rising in her throat. They killed him. The official report said it was a drunk driver who was never found, but Thomas had told me about the pendant, about what Mrs. Whitmore had said. He knew they were coming for him. Eleanor reached under her pillow and pulled out a small manila envelope. He managed to get this to me before he died. Had a cab driver deliver it, along with instructions not to give you the pendant until you were old enough to handle the truth, or until our family was desperate enough to need what was inside. Grace opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a handwritten letter in her father's familiar script. My dearest Eleanor, if you're reading this, then they got to me before I could expose what the Whitmore family has done. Margaret Whitmore died tonight trying to do the right thing, and I'm probably going to die trying to honor her wishes. The pendant contains evidence that could destroy Charles Whitmore and everyone who's helped him cover up years of murder and corruption. But it's also dangerous. Dangerous enough that they killed a good woman, and will probably kill me too. Don't give it to Grace until she's old enough to understand what it means, or until our family has no other choice. When that time comes, she'll know what to do. She's stronger than both of us, Eleanor. She's strong enough to finish what Margaret started. I love you both more than life itself. Take care of our girl. Thomas Grace read the letter 3 times before the words sank in. Her father had known he was going to die. had known that keeping Margaret's secret would cost him everything, but he'd chosen to protect the evidence anyway. "Why didn't you tell me?" Grace's voice was barely audible. "All these years. Why didn't you tell me he was murdered?" "Because you were 18 years old and already carrying too much weight," Eleanor said fiercely. "Because I wanted you to have a chance at a normal life. Because I hoped we'd never be desperate enough to need what was in that pendant. But we were," Grace said, understanding flooding through her. "When you got sick, when the bills started piling up, I held out as long as I could. But when the doctors started talking about experimental treatments we couldn't afford, when I saw you working yourself to death trying to keep us afloat," Eleanor's voice broke. "I knew it was time. I knew Thomas would want you to have every possible weapon to fight with." Grace thought about Jonathan, about his kindness, about the way he looked at her like she was precious, about the job that had saved their lives and the man who had given it to her. "Mom," she said slowly, "I think I'm working for them, the Whitmore family. I think Jonathan Whitmore hired me because of the pendant." Eleanor's eyes went wide. "Oh, Gracie, what have we gotten you into?" "I don't know," Grace admitted, "but I'm starting to think Dad was right. I'm strong enough to finish what Margaret started." She stood up, her mind already racing with plans she wasn't ready to make. "I need to go. I need to figure out what to do with what I know." "Be careful," Eleanor called as Grace reached the door. "The Whitmore family has been killing people to protect their secrets for decades. Don't underestimate what they'll do to a girl from Queens who threatens their empire." Grace paused, her hand on the doorknob. "Mom, do you think Dad would be proud of me if I used the evidence to bring them down?" Eleanor's smile was sad but proud. "Honey, I think your father has been waiting 5 years for you to be ready to make them pay." As Grace walked back through the hospital corridors, she felt the weight of the pendant around her neck differently now. It wasn't just jewelry anymore. It was a weapon her father had died protecting, that Margaret Whitmore had died creating. And tomorrow, Grace would have to look Jonathan Whitmore in the eye and pretend she didn't know that his family had murdered her father in cold blood. Grace spent the entire subway ride back to Manhattan staring at her reflection in the dark window, trying to figure out how to look at Jonathan Whitmore without screaming. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her father walking toward Mount Sinai, alive and hopeful, not knowing that a black sedan was bearing down on him. The Whitmore building looked different now, less like a palace and more like a fortress built on graves. Grace's keycard still worked. The elevators still carried her to the 32nd floor. But everything felt contaminated by the truth she now carried. It was past 7 p.m., and most of the office was empty. Grace had hoped to slip in, grab her things, and figure out her next move from the safety of her apartment. But as she approached her office, she saw light spilling from Jonathan's doorway. He was still here. Grace stood frozen in the hallway, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could turn around, leave, never come back, find another job, take care of her mother some other way, let sleeping secrets stay buried. But then she thought about Margaret Whitmore's terrified face on that video, about her father's letter, about all the other victims whose names she'd seen in those files, people who died because Charles Whitmore decided their lives were less important than his money. Grace knocked on Jonathan's door. "Come in," his voice called, and Grace stepped into the office that had changed her life 3 weeks ago. Jonathan looked up from his computer, and his face brightened in a way that made Grace's chest ache. "Grace, I didn't expect you back tonight. How's your mother?" "Better," Grace said. And it was true in more ways than one. Eleanor had looked more alive tonight than she had in months, as if finally sharing her secret had lifted a weight from her shoulders. "The doctors are optimistic about the new treatment plan." "That's wonderful news." Jonathan stood up, and Grace noticed how tired he looked. His tie was loosened, his hair mussed like he'd been running his hands through it. "I'm glad the insurance is working out. The insurance he was paying for, the job he'd given her, the kindness he'd shown to the daughter of the man his family had murdered." Grace felt something crack inside her chest. "Jonathan," she said, and his name felt different on her tongue now, more dangerous. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." He moved around his desk, closer to her, and Grace caught that familiar scent of expensive cologne mixed with something uniquely him. "What's on your mind?" "That night, December 15th, what do you remember about it?" Jonathan went very still. "Why do you want to know?" "Because I've been thinking about what you said, About my father trying to save your wife. I want to understand what happened." Jonathan was quiet for so long that Grace wondered if he'd heard her. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft and distant. "I was supposed to be with her that night. Margaret had some charity function uptown, and I'd promised to go, but I got caught up in a conference call with investors that ran late." He moved to the window, staring out at the city lights. "She called me around 8 p.m., said she was tired and was going to head home early. That was the last time I spoke to her." Grace watched his reflection in the glass, noting the pain carved into his features. "You blame yourself. Every single day." Jonathan's laugh was hollow. "If I'd been there, if I'd gone with her like I promised, maybe things would have been different. Or maybe you'd both be dead." The words slipped out before Grace could stop them, and Jonathan turned to look at her with surprise. "That's a dark thought," he said. Grace shrugged, trying to look casual while her heart raced. "Just being realistic. Accidents happen to everyone, rich or poor. Except it wasn't an accident." The words hung in the air between them like a bomb. Grace felt the blood drain from her face, but she forced herself to stay calm. "What do you mean?" Jonathan ran a hand through his hair, looking suddenly older than his 35 years. "I've never told anyone this. The police report said it was brake failure, mechanical error, but I had that car serviced the week before Margaret died. Everything was perfect." He turned back to face her, and Grace saw something vulnerable in his eyes. "I hired a private investigator after the funeral. He found evidence that someone had tampered with the brake lines. Subtle work. Professional. Made to look like an accident." Grace's mouth went dry. "Did you tell the police?" "I tried, but the investigator died in a house fire before he could submit his report. Electrical problem, they said. Just another accident." Jonathan's smile was bitter. "Funny how many accidents seem to happen around my family." Grace felt like she was walking on a tightrope over an abyss. "Are you saying someone murdered your wife?" "I'm saying that powerful people make powerful enemies, and sometimes those enemies don't care about collateral damage." "Collateral damage like my father." Jonathan nodded, his expression grave. "Thomas was in the wrong place at the wrong time. If he hadn't been driving for us that night, he'd still be alive," Grace finished, and she wasn't acting anymore. The pain in her voice was real, raw, years in the making. "Grace." Jonathan moved closer, and she could see her own grief reflected in his eyes. "I'm sorry, I know that doesn't change anything, doesn't bring him back, but I'm sorry that my family's problems cost you your father." Grace wanted to hate him. It would be so much easier if she could hate him. But looking into his eyes, seeing the genuine remorse there, she realized that Jonathan was as much a victim as she was. He'd lost his wife, lived with guilt for 5 years, and had no idea that his own family was responsible for both their tragedies. "I dream about him sometimes," Grace said softly. "About that night. I wonder what his last thoughts were. Probably about you and your mother," Jonathan said. "About making sure you were taken care of." Grace felt tears prick her eyes. "Is that why you hired me? Because you feel guilty about my father?" Jonathan was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "At first, maybe, when I saw the pendant, when I realized who you were, yes, guilt was part of it, but it's not anymore. Then what is it?" Jonathan stepped closer, close enough that Grace could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "It's you, Grace. The way you carry yourself, the way you fight for your mother, the way you walked into this office in broken shoes and made me feel something I thought died with Margaret." Grace's breath caught. "Jonathan, I know it's inappropriate. I know there's a power imbalance. And I know your father died because of my family's enemies. But I can't stop thinking about you." He reached up, his fingers barely brushing her cheek. "You're not just working for me anymore, Grace. You're saving me." Grace felt her resolve crumbling. This man, this beautiful, broken man who'd shown her such kindness, who'd literally saved her mother's life. He had no idea that his own father was a monster, had no idea that the guilt he carried was nothing compared to the truth she was hiding. "Jonathan," she whispered, and she saw something in his eyes shift, something that made her heart race for entirely different reasons. "Tell me to stop," he said softly. "Tell me this is wrong, and I'll go back to being your boss and nothing more." Grace knew she should tell him to stop, should push him away, walk out of that office, and never look back. Should use the evidence in her pendant to destroy his family and get justice for her father. Instead, she rose up on her toes and kissed him. Jonathan's arms came around her immediately, pulling her against him like she was an anchor in a storm. The kiss was desperate, hungry, full of grief and longing and something that felt dangerously close to love. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Grace saw her own confusion reflected in Jonathan's eyes. "This is crazy," she whispered. "Completely insane," he agreed, his forehead resting against hers. "We can't do this." "I know," but neither of them moved away. They stood there in his office, holding each other like they were the only two people left in the world. While the weight of secrets and lies and buried truths pressed down around them, Grace closed her eyes and let herself have this moment. This one perfect, impossible moment, before reality came crashing back down. Because tomorrow, she would still have evidence that could destroy him. Tomorrow, she would still have to choose between love and justice. But tonight, for just a few more heartbeats, she could pretend that some stories had happy endings. Grace hadn't slept in 3 days. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Jonathan's face from that night in his office, the way he'd looked at her like she was something precious, something worth saving. Then the images would shift. Her father's broken body on a Queen Street, Margaret Whitmore bleeding out in a twisted car, Charles Whitmore's signature on documents that ordered people's deaths. She was living in two worlds now, and the space between them was getting smaller every day. At work, she played her part perfectly. She organized Jonathan's schedule, fielded his calls, and pretended her heart didn't skip when he smiled at her. They hadn't kissed again, hadn't even talked about what had happened. But the tension between them was thick enough to cut with a knife. Grace caught him watching her sometimes, his eyes dark with something that looked like longing mixed with confusion. The other employees had started to notice. Cynthia from accounting made pointed comments about girls who advanced quickly in their careers. Janet from HR had pulled Grace aside yesterday to remind her about the company's policies regarding workplace relationships. But none of that mattered, because Grace had made her decision. She was going to bring down Charles Whitmore, even if it destroyed the man she was falling in love with. The research had taken her 3 sleepless nights, but she'd finally found what she needed. Detective Maria Santos of the NYPD, currently working cold cases in Brooklyn. According to Grace's internet searches, Santos had built a reputation for taking on cases that other cops wouldn't touch, especially ones involving corruption in high places. More importantly, Santos had never worked a case involving the Whitmore family, which meant she probably wasn't on Charles's payroll. Grace had spent hours crafting the email, trying to find the right words to explain what she had without sounding like a conspiracy theorist. In the end, she'd kept it simple. Detective Santos, I have evidence regarding multiple unsolved murders connected to organized crime in Manhattan. This includes the 2019 deaths of Margaret Whitmore and Thomas Sullivan, which were ruled accidental but were actually orchestrated hits. The evidence is substantial and comes from a reliable source. I'm willing to meet in person to discuss the details. This is extremely sensitive, and my life may be in danger if this information becomes public before arrests are made. Grace Sullivan, she'd hit send at 3 a.m. this morning, and now she was sitting in her office trying to act normal while waiting for a response that might change everything. Her computer chimed with a new email, and Grace's heart jumped. But it wasn't Detective Santos. It was an internal message from Jonathan. Can you come to my office? We need to discuss the Morrison contract. Grace frowned. There was no Morrison contract on Jonathan's schedule, and she handled all his business correspondence. This had to be code for something else. She found Jonathan standing by his window again. But this time, his posture was different. Tense, alert, like a man preparing for battle. Close the door, he said without turning around. Grace did as he asked, her pulse quickening. What's wrong? Jonathan turned to face her, and Grace saw something in his expression that made her blood run cold. Fear. My father wants to meet you, he said simply. Grace felt the floor drop out from under her. What? Charles heard about my new assistant. He's curious about you. Apparently, someone mentioned that you bear a resemblance to Margaret. Grace's hand flew instinctively to her pendant. I don't understand. Why would that matter? Jonathan's laugh was hollow. Because my father doesn't believe in coincidences. And because he's been asking questions about the night Margaret died ever since I hired you." The room started spinning. What kind of questions? About Thomas Sullivan, about what happened to his family after he died, about whether there were any loose ends that might need to be tied up. Grace felt like she was drowning. Charles Whitmore was investigating her, which meant he was starting to put the pieces together. If he discovered the pendant, if he realized what she knew... "Jonathan," she said carefully, "what exactly did your father say about me?" "He wants to meet you this afternoon. A family dinner at the estate in the Hamptons. He said it's time he got to know the people who work closely with his son." Grace's mind raced. This was either an opportunity or a trap, and she couldn't tell which. But one thing was clear. If Charles Whitmore wanted to meet her, it meant her time was running out. "Do I have a choice?" Jonathan's expression was grim. "With my father, no one ever has a choice." 2 hours later, Grace found herself in the passenger seat of Jonathan's Tesla, watching the Manhattan skyline disappear behind them. The drive to the Hamptons would take 90 minutes, and the silence between them felt heavy with unspoken words. "Grace," Jonathan said finally, "I need to tell you something about my father." Grace kept her eyes on the road ahead. "What about him? He's not a good man." Jonathan's knuckles were white where they gripped the steering wheel. "I've suspected it for years, but I could never prove anything. Deals that went his way too easily, competitors who backed down for no apparent reason, people who crossed him and then disappeared from the business world entirely." Grace's throat felt tight. "You think he's dangerous?" "I think my father would do anything to protect the family name and the family fortune." "Anything?" Jonathan glanced at her, and Grace saw genuine concern in his eyes. "If he asks you personal questions tonight, be careful how you answer. Don't give him any information he could use against you." Too late for that, Grace thought. Charles Whitmore already had enough information to get her killed. He just didn't know it yet. "Jonathan," she said softly, "what if I told you that everything you suspected about your father was true? What if I said he was responsible for terrible things, including Margaret's death?" Jonathan was quiet for so long that Grace wondered if he'd heard her. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I'd say that I've been waiting 5 years for someone to prove it." Grace turned to stare at him. "What?" "The private investigator who died in that house fire. He wasn't the only one I hired. I've been quietly investigating my father for years, trying to find proof of what I suspected, but he's too careful, too connected. Every lead goes cold. Every witness disappears." Jonathan's jaw clenched. "If I could prove that he killed Margaret, that he's responsible for all the deaths I suspect him of, I'd turn him in myself." Grace felt her heart hammering against her ribs. This was it. The moment she'd been preparing for. The moment when she could tell Jonathan the truth, show him the evidence, and let him help her bring down his father. But something held her back. A nagging voice in her head that whispered warnings about trust, about the danger of revealing too much too soon. What if Jonathan wasn't as innocent as he seemed? What if his investigation of his father was just a cover story? What if this whole conversation was a trap designed to make her reveal what she knew? Grace thought about her mother's words. The Whitmore family has been killing people to protect their secrets for decades. All Whitmores, including Jonathan. "Grace," Jonathan's voice pulled her from her thoughts. "You're very quiet. Just nervous about meeting your father," she said, which was true enough. Just be yourself, and everything will be fine." But Grace knew that being herself tonight might be the most dangerous thing she could do. Because herself was the daughter of Thomas Sullivan, keeper of Margaret Whitmore's secrets, and the only person alive who could prove that Charles Whitmore was a murderer, as they pulled into the circular drive of the Whitmore estate, a massive Georgian mansion that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Grace made a silent promise to her father's memory. She would find out tonight whether Jonathan Whitmore was an ally or an enemy, and depending on what she learned, she would either gain the most powerful weapon in her fight for justice, or she would be walking into the last trap she'd ever see. The mansion's front door opened, and a figure stepped onto the stone steps. Even from a distance, Grace could see the family resemblance, the sharp features, the commanding presence, the aura of absolute power. Charles Whitmore was waiting for her. Charles Whitmore was everything Grace had expected, and worse. At 72, he still commanded attention like a king holding court, his silver hair perfectly styled, his tailored suit worth more than most people's cars. But there was something off about his eyes, a distant quality that made Grace wonder if the man who'd ordered her father's death was still entirely present. "So you're the famous Grace Sullivan," Charles said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never been told no. "Jonathan tells me you've been quite an asset to the company." Grace forced herself to smile and shake his offered hand, trying not to think about the blood on those manicured fingers. "Thank you, sir. It's an honor to meet you." The dining room was a monument to wealth and power. Crystal chandeliers, oil paintings worth more than Grace's childhood home, a table that could seat 20 people comfortably. But tonight it was set for just 3, creating an intimate atmosphere that felt more like an interrogation than a family dinner. Throughout the meal, Charles peppered Grace with questions that seemed casual, but felt anything but. Where was she from? What was her family like? Had she always lived in New York? Each question felt like a probe, testing for weaknesses or inconsistencies. Grace answered carefully, sticking as close to the truth as possible while revealing nothing that could be used against her. Yes, she was from Queens. Yes, her father had died when she was young. No, she didn't have much family left besides her sick mother. Jonathan seemed increasingly uncomfortable as the evening progressed, shooting warning glances at his father whenever the questions got too personal. But Charles ignored his son's signals. His attention focused entirely on Grace with the intensity of a predator studying prey. "Your father," Charles said suddenly, cutting through Grace's description of her college plans. "What did you say his name was?" Grace's heart skipped, but she kept her voice steady. "Thomas Sullivan." "Sullivan," Charles repeated the name slowly, like he was tasting it. "That name sounds familiar. What did he do for work?" "He was a driver," Grace said, watching Charles's face carefully for any reaction. "He worked for different families around the city." Something flickered in Charles's eyes. Recognition? Maybe. Or suspicion. A driver? How interesting. Did he ever mention any of the families he worked for? "Sometimes," Grace said carefully. "He didn't like to bring work home, though." Charles leaned back in his chair, studying Grace with renewed interest. "You know, you remind me of someone. There's something about your face, your mannerisms." Jonathan cleared his throat. "Dad, I think Grace has answered enough questions for one evening." But Charles wasn't listening to his son anymore. His eyes had gone distant, unfocused, like he was seeing something that wasn't quite there. "Margaret," he whispered, and Grace felt ice form in her veins. "Dad." Jonathan's voice carried a note of concern that Grace didn't think was entirely about his father's behavior. Charles blinked, his focus returning to the present. But when he looked at Grace again, there was something new in his expression, a clarity that was somehow more terrifying than the confusion. "Yes," he said slowly. "You look exactly like Margaret did at your age. The same eyes, the same stubborn set to your jaw. It's remarkable, really." Grace forced herself to breathe normally. "I'm sorry. I don't know who you're referring to." "My daughter-in-law," Charles said, his voice gaining strength. "Jonathan's wife. She died 5 years ago in a terrible accident." "I'm sorry for your loss," Grace said automatically. Charles's smile was thin and cold. Are you really sorry, Miss Sullivan?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Jonathan was looking between his father and Grace with growing alarm. But Grace couldn't take her eyes off Charles. She could see something building behind his eyes, something dangerous and unpredictable. "Dad, maybe we should—" "She was a problem, you know," Charles continued, his voice taking on a dreamy quality. "Margaret, always sticking her nose where it didn't belong, always asking questions about things that were none of her business." Grace's hand moved instinctively to her pendant, and she saw Charles's eyes track the movement. "Beautiful necklace," he said conversationally. "Gold work like that is quite distinctive. Where did you get it?" "It was a gift," Grace said, her throat tight. "From whom?" Grace hesitated a moment too long, and she saw something shift in Charles's expression. The mask of confused elderly man was slipping, revealing something sharp and calculating underneath. "From my father," she said finally. "Your father." Charles nodded slowly. "Thomas Sullivan, the driver." The way he said her father's name made Grace's skin crawl. There was knowledge in his voice, recognition, and something that sounded almost like satisfaction. "Jonathan," Charles said without taking his eyes off Grace, "would you mind checking on dinner? I think the staff might need some guidance in the kitchen." Jonathan looked like he wanted to refuse, but years of ingrained obedience won out. "Of course, Dad. I'll be right back." Grace watched Jonathan leave with growing dread. Being alone with Charles, Whitmore was the last thing she wanted, but she couldn't think of a way to avoid it without raising more suspicions. As soon as the dining room door closed behind Jonathan, Charles's entire demeanor changed. The polite grandfather act evaporated, replaced by something cold and predatory. "Now then," he said, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Shall we dispense with the pleasantries?" Grace tried to keep her expression neutral. "I'm not sure what you mean," Charles laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Oh, my dear girl, you're very good. I'll give you that. For a moment there, you almost had me convinced that this was all just a remarkable coincidence." Grace's pulse was hammering so hard she was sure Charles could hear it. "Sir, I really don't know what you're talking about." "The pendant," Charles said simply. "It belonged to Margaret, didn't it?" Grace felt the world tilt sideways. "I told you. It was a gift from my father. Yes, Thomas Sullivan, the driver who was supposed to die with my daughter-in-law 5 years ago but somehow managed to survive the crash. The man who made the mistake of thinking he could blackmail my family." Charles leaned forward, his eyes boring into Grace's. "The man I had killed 2 blocks from Mount Sinai Hospital." The admission hit Grace like a physical blow. She sat frozen, staring at this man who had just casually confessed to murdering her father. "You're wondering if I'm recording this conversation," Charles continued conversationally, "if I'm stupid enough to incriminate myself. But you see, my dear, it doesn't matter what I say to you, because just like your father, you're not going to live long enough to repeat it." Grace found her voice. "You're confessing to murder." "I'm cleaning up loose ends," Charles corrected. "Margaret thought she was so clever, copying all those files, thinking she could threaten me with exposure, but she made one crucial mistake. She trusted the wrong person." Charles's eyes were bright with madness now, the careful facade completely gone. "Your father promised to keep her secrets safe, and he did. Didn't he? Right up until the moment my driver crushed him like a bug on the asphalt." Grace felt tears burning her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Why kill them? Because they threatened everything I built." Charles's voice rose to a shout, then dropped back to a whisper. 50 years of work, of careful planning, of eliminating obstacles and eliminating witnesses. I wasn't going to let some bleeding heart daughter-in-law and her pet driver destroy it all. "Jonathan doesn't know," Grace said, understanding flooding through her. "He doesn't know what you are." Charles's smile was genuinely fond. "Jonathan is weak, just like his mother was. Too much conscience. Not enough ambition, he suspects, of course. But he's never had the stomach to dig too deep." "But you killed his wife." "I eliminated a threat to the family," Charles corrected. "Margaret would have destroyed us all with her righteousness. Jonathan will thank me eventually when he's older and understands how the world really works." Charles stood up, moving around the table toward Grace with predatory grace. "The real question, my dear, is what we're going to do about you." Grace shot to her feet, her chair clattering backward. "Jonathan will be back any minute. Jonathan is taking a very important phone call from Tokyo. He'll be busy for quite some time." Charles was close enough now that Grace could smell his expensive cologne mixed with something that might have been madness. "You have something that belongs to me, don't you? Something your father stole from my daughter-in-law." Grace backed toward the door, but Charles was between her and escape. "I don't know what you're talking about. The pendant, my dear. I know what's inside it. And I know that you've opened it, because you wouldn't be here otherwise. The question is, who else knows what you've found?" Grace's mind raced. If she told him about Detective Santos, about the evidence she'd copied, he might kill her immediately. But if she lied, if she made him think she was the only one who knew— "No one," she said quickly. "I haven't told anyone." Charles studied her face for a long moment, then smiled. "You know, I almost believe you, almost." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small silver object that made Grace's blood freeze. "A gun. Just like your father," Charles said conversationally. "You're going to have a very unfortunate accident. The gun in Charles Whitmore's hand looked small and elegant, like everything else in his world. Beautiful, expensive, and deadly. "You know," Charles said conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather instead of Grace's imminent death. "I've always found it fascinating how history repeats itself. Your father thought he was so clever, hiding that evidence, thinking he could use it against me someday." Grace pressed herself against the dining room wall, her mind racing through escape options. The windows were too high. The door was blocked by Charles, and even if she screamed, who would hear her in this massive house? But Thomas made a crucial error in judgment, Charles continued, the gun steady in his hand. "He assumed I wouldn't hurt an innocent man. He didn't understand that there are no innocent people in my world, only assets and liabilities." "Like Margaret," Grace said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "She was your son's wife, your daughter-in-law, and you murdered her in cold blood." Charles's expression darkened. Margaret was a naive girl who thought she could play in a man's game. She had no idea what it takes to build an empire, to maintain power in a world that would tear you apart the moment you show weakness. She had evidence of your crimes. She was going to expose you. She was going to destroy everything. Charles's voice rose to a shout, spittle flying from his lips. 50 years of work, 50 years of careful planning, of eliminating obstacles, of building something that would last for generations. The mask was completely off now. Grace could see the madness that had been lurking beneath Charles's polite facade, the paranoia and rage that had driven him to kill anyone who threatened his empire. "Margaret found out about the money laundering," Grace said, remembering the files on the SD card. "About the murders you ordered to protect your business interests. Margaret found out about survival," Charles snapped. "About doing what's necessary to stay on top. The weak get devoured, Miss Sullivan. The strong do whatever it takes to protect what's theirs, by killing innocent people, by eliminating threats." Charles stepped closer, and Grace could see her reflection in the gun's polished surface. "Just like I'm going to eliminate you." That's when the dining room door burst open. Jonathan stood in the doorway, his face a mask of horror and disbelief. His eyes took in the scene instantly, his father holding a gun on Grace, the confession hanging in the air like smoke. "Dad?" Jonathan's voice was barely a whisper. "What the hell is going on?" Charles didn't lower the gun, but Grace saw something flicker across his features. Surprise, maybe, or disappointment. "Jonathan, I told you to take that call from Tokyo." There was no call. Jonathan stepped into the room, his movements slow and careful. "I got suspicious when you insisted I leave, Dad." "Put the gun down." "I'm afraid I can't do that, son." Charles's voice was suddenly gentle, almost paternal. "This young lady has something that belongs to our family, and she's made some very serious accusations." Jonathan's eyes found Grace's, and she saw the moment he understood. The pendant, her father's death, the connection between their families. It all clicked into place. "She knows," Jonathan said, and it wasn't a question. "She knows everything." Charles's grip on the gun tightened. "And just like her father before her, she's going to have a very unfortunate accident. The way Margaret had an accident." Jonathan's voice was deadly quiet. Charles went very still. "What did you say?" "I said, the way Margaret had an accident, the way Thomas Sullivan had an accident, the way everyone who threatens this family seems to have accidents." Grace watched the two men face each other across the opulent dining room, and she realized she was witnessing something that had been building for years. Jonathan's suspicions, his investigations, his quiet rebellion against a father he'd never fully trusted. "Jonathan," Charles said carefully, "you don't understand the full situation." "Then explain it to me." Jonathan moved closer to his father, his hands raised in a non-threatening gesture. "Explain to me why you're holding a gun on an innocent woman. Explain to me why my wife really died. Explain to me what kind of monster I've been calling father for 35 years. Charles's laugh was bitter and broken. "Monster. I'm the man who built everything you've ever known. The money that paid for your education. The connections that got you your first job. The power that made you who you are. All of it came from me." "Built on what?" Jonathan demanded. "Built on how many bodies?" "Built on strength," Charles shouted. "Built on doing what needed to be done when soft men like you wouldn't have the stomach for it." Grace saw her chance. While father and son were focused on each other, she edged slowly toward the far side of the room, putting distance between herself and Charles's gun. "Margaret," Jonathan said, his voice cracking. "Tell me about Margaret." Charles's expression softened, and for a moment, he looked like a tired old man instead of a killer. "She was going to destroy us." "Jonathan, she found files that would have sent me to prison for life, would have destroyed the company, would have left you with nothing. So you had her killed. I protected our family." Charles's voice rose again. "Just like I protected us from every other threat over the years. The politicians who wouldn't stay bought, the competitors who wouldn't back down, the journalists who asked too many questions. I eliminated them all." Jonathan staggered backward like he'd been punched. How many people have you killed?" "I don't kill people, Jonathan. I hire professionals to solve problems. There's a difference." "Is there?" Jonathan's laugh was hollow. "Is there really a difference between pulling the trigger and ordering someone else to do it?" Grace reached the far wall and pressed her back against it, trying to stay out of the line of fire while the two men tore each other apart with words that had been buried for decades. "You're weak," Charles said, his voice full of contempt. "Just like your mother was. Too much conscience. Not enough spine. Do you think this empire built itself? Do you think power just falls into your lap because you deserve it?" "I think," Jonathan said quietly, "that some things aren't worth the price you've paid for them." Charles raised the gun again, but this time it wasn't pointed at Grace. It was pointed at his own son. "Don't make me choose between you and the family legacy, Jonathan, because you won't like my choice." Grace saw Jonathan's face go white, saw the moment he realized that his father was capable of killing him too. Charles Whitmore had crossed so many lines, had committed so many murders, that one more wouldn't even register. "Dad," Jonathan said carefully, "I'm your son. You're a liability." Charles replied, "Just like Margaret was, just like Thomas Sullivan was, just like she is." He swung the gun back toward Grace, and she saw her death in his eyes. That's when Jonathan lunged. Father and son crashed to the floor in a tangle of limbs and expensive fabric. The gun went flying, skittering across the marble floor toward Grace's feet. She dove for it, her fingers closing around the cold metal just as Charles broke free from Jonathan's grip. "Give me the gun," Charles demanded, blood trickling from a split lip. "Give it to me now and I might let you live long enough to see your mother again." Grace looked at the weapon in her hands, then at Jonathan, who was struggling to his feet with pain written across his face. She thought about her father, about Margaret, about all the people Charles Whitmore had killed to protect his empire of blood and money. "No," she said simply. Grace pulled out her phone with her free hand and dialed 911, never taking her eyes off Charles. "This is Grace Sullivan," she said when the operator answered. "I'm at the Whitmore estate in the Hamptons, and I need police immediately. I have evidence of multiple murders, and the perpetrator is here with me now." Charles's face went gray. "You have no idea what you've just done." "I've done what my father died trying to do," Grace said. "I've made sure you finally pay for your crimes." As sirens wailed in the distance, Grace looked at Jonathan and saw her own heartbreaking reflected in his eyes. She'd saved their lives, but she'd also destroyed any chance they might have had together, because some truths were too heavy for love to bear. 6 months later, Grace stood at the window of her mother's hospital room, watching the first snow of winter dust the streets of Manhattan. Eleanor was sitting up in bed, color in her cheeks for the first time in years. Reading a novel that Grace had brought her the day before, the experimental treatment had worked. Against all odds, against every grim prognosis, Eleanor Sullivan was in remission. "You're brooding again," Eleanor said without looking up from her book. Grace smiled despite herself. "I'm not brooding. I'm contemplating. Same thing, just with fancier vocabulary." Eleanor set down her book and studied her daughter with eyes that saw too much. "How long has it been since you've seen him?" Grace didn't need to ask who him was. Jonathan's name hung between them like a ghost, mentioned rarely but never forgotten. 3 months, Grace said quietly. "Not since the sentencing." Charles Whitmore had been sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The evidence from Margaret's SD card, combined with his recorded confession and Detective Santos's investigation, had been overwhelming. The media had called it the crime story of the decade, a billionaire patriarch brought down by the daughter of one of his victims. What the media didn't know was the cost of that justice. He loved you, Eleanor said gently. That was real, even if everything else was complicated. Grace touched the empty space at her throat where the pendant used to hang. She'd given it to the FBI as evidence, along with copies of all the files, the golden locket that had connected her to Jonathan, that had started this whole impossible story, was now sitting in an evidence locker somewhere in downtown Manhattan. Love wasn't enough, Grace said. How could it be? His father murdered my father. Some things can't be forgiven, even if they weren't his fault. Can't they? Grace turned to look at her mother, hearing something in her voice that made her chest tight. Mom, your father would have wanted you to be happy, Gracie. He would have wanted you to live your life, not spend it carrying his pain. Before Grace could respond, there was a soft knock on the hospital room door. Grace's heart skipped, but it was just Dr. Martinez, Eleanor's oncologist, carrying a manila folder. Good afternoon, ladies, Dr. Martinez said with the kind of smile that meant good news. I have Eleanor's latest test results. Grace held her breath while the doctor reviewed the numbers. Even though she knew what he was going to say, Eleanor's recovery had been nothing short of miraculous, thanks to the treatments that Jonathan's insurance had made possible. Insurance that was still active, even though Grace no longer worked for Whitmore Corporation. Even though the company had been dissolved in the wake of Charles's arrest and conviction. Everything looks excellent, Dr. Martinez confirmed. The tumor markers are undetectable, and your white cell count is back to normal. I'd say we can start talking about discharge planning. After the doctor left, Grace sank into the chair beside her mother's bed, overwhelmed by relief and gratitude, and a dozen other emotions she couldn't name. You know, Eleanor said conversationally, I got a visitor yesterday while you were at work. Grace looked up sharply. Who? A young man with very sad eyes and an expensive suit, said his name was Jonathan. Grace's heart stopped. He was here, why didn't you tell me? Because I wanted to hear what he had to say first. Eleanor's expression was gentle but firm. He wanted to know how you were doing, whether you were happy, whether you'd found another job. Grace felt tears prick her eyes. What did you tell him? I told him the truth, that you were surviving, but not living, that you'd thrown yourself into your work at the women's shelter, but that you came home every night looking like you'd lost something precious. Grace worked at a domestic violence shelter now, using the skills she'd learned at Whitmore Corporation to help women escape dangerous situations. It was meaningful work, important work, but it paid a fraction of what she'd earned before. Somehow, though, they were managing. Jonathan had made sure of that. He also gave me this, Eleanor said, reaching into her nightstand drawer and pulling out a small velvet box. Grace stared at the box like it might explode. Mom, I can't open it, Eleanor said firmly. With trembling fingers, Grace lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in white silk, was her pendant, but it was different now, restored to its original beauty, polished until it gleamed like captured sunlight, and beside it was a small folded piece of paper. Grace unfolded the note with shaking hands. Grace, Detective Santos told me the FBI was finished with the evidence, and I thought you should have this back. It belongs with you, not in some government warehouse. I've also established a foundation in Margaret's and Thomas's names, dedicated to helping families of crime victims. I'd like you to run it, if you're willing. The salary is competitive and the work would be meaningful. I know I can't undo the past. I know I can't change what my father did to your family, but I can try to honor the memory of the people we both loved by making sure their deaths meant something. You don't have to see me. You don't have to forgive me. But please don't let my father's crimes stop you from doing the work you were meant to do. The world needs more people like you, Grace Sullivan. People who choose justice over comfort, truth over convenience. People who are brave enough to carry the weight of difficult truths. Jonathan P.S. Your mother is remarkable. I can see where you get your strength. Grace read the letter 3 times before the words fully sank in. Jonathan wanted her to run a foundation. He wanted to honor their father's memories, to turn tragedy into something positive. He wanted to give her a way to continue fighting for justice, without destroying herself in the process. What will you tell him? Eleanor asked softly. Grace closed her eyes, feeling the pendant's familiar weight in her palm. For 6 months, she'd been carrying the burden of what had happened alone. The guilt over destroying Jonathan's family. The pain of losing something that had felt like love. The crushing weight of choosing justice over happiness. But maybe her mother was right. Maybe her father would have wanted her to find a way to be happy, to build something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. Maybe some wounds could heal, given enough time and care and hope. Grace opened her eyes and reached for her phone. "I'm going to call him," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Eleanor smiled. "Good. Some conversations are too important to avoid forever." Grace dialed the number from memory, her heart hammering as it rang once, twice. "Grace." Jonathan's voice was cautious, hopeful, careful not to assume too much. "I got your note," Grace said. "And the pendant. Thank you. You don't need to thank me. It was always yours." They were both quiet for a moment, the weight of 6 months of silence hanging between them. "Jonathan," Grace said finally, "I'd like to talk. About the foundation. About everything. Would you meet me somewhere? Somewhere neutral?" "Anywhere you want," he said immediately. "Anytime." Grace looked out the window at the snow falling on the city below, at the people walking the streets with their own stories of love and loss and second chances. "Central Park," she said. "Tomorrow at noon, by the carousel. I'll be there." Grace hung up and fastened the pendant around her neck, feeling its familiar weight settle against her heart. It was heavier now, weighted with everything that had happened, everything they'd lost and found and might still discover. But for the first time in 6 months, Grace Sullivan felt something that resembled hope. Some truths were too heavy to carry alone. But maybe, just maybe, they didn't have to.